Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 92 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, my guest is Dr. Alex Dressler, a professor of classics at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Focusing on the Roman world, his publications include articles on feminism, queer theory, comedy, ancient aesthetics, Roman philosophy, and Michel Foucault. In addition to Greek and Latin, he teaches courses on classical and Christian approaches to death and exemplarity, the history of the self in antiquity and modernity, sex and power in Greco-Roman culture, and gender, race, and class in medieval Latin literature. In this episode, we discuss his favorite Roman poets and Sappho's legacy, queer theory and its relationship to classics, and issues of politics, death, and Christianity in the ancient world. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today on the show. Now, I want to start out and just ask you, when did your love of all things ancient start?
Well, probably, I think it began when I was in high school or maybe a little earlier. I think for a lot of people, there might have been some interest, when I was very young in foreign old things, decoding and stuff like that. But then the thing that really sort of consolidated it was my love in high school for English poetry. Actually, a lot of it was modernist stuff, so early 20th century stuff, but it extended all the way back. I always felt like I wanted to get to the source or something. And a lot of that modernist poetry that I was really interested in, like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were two big poets. They drew a lot on earlier English literature, as well as classical Greek and Roman stuff. They would just use Latin and Greek in their poems. And I remember feeling excluded from that. And I wanted to figure it out and break the code. So I started reading further and further back in English. And then it became clear to me in maybe 10th grade or something, I would need to learn Latin and Greek if I wanted to continue this mission. I was lucky. I went to a school where they didn't offer that, but we had a theater teacher who also dressed a little bit like a pirate and everybody really liked. And he got an undergraduate degree in Latin, was quite good at it. And so he was able to teach Latin. And so they got him to do it, as long as I could get a few people together for it. So I got a few people together who were interested. I convinced 4 or 5 of my friends. And so we had a Latin class, and then it just continued. And then as soon as I went to undergrad, I was well, now it's time to really start Greek in earnest and just continue all the way through. So that's kind of how that happened.
That's awesome. I mean, so by the time you got to college, were you well prepared, and did you know classics was an acceptable major that you could go and do? Or did you have any thoughts of well, I like this, but I might want to major in something else?
I had no thoughts of majoring in anything else. maybe English or comparative literature. But I had no thoughts. It was a complete one direction. And I was very lucky and privileged in that teacher I had gone to my undergrad institution. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and I went to high school there. And he had graduated from Brown, but he was also from Rhode Island. And so I ended up going to Brown and working with his teachers. And that was kind of how that proceeded. Most people don't come to it that way. I had a lot of luck lined up. If you think this is a good thing, a lot of luck lined up to get me to this point.
Nice. Yeah. Some people, I almost envy the people who were on the one track mind that just they come in and they're yep, this is what I'm doing. Yeah, you don't waste time dilly-dallying, being I'm going to have a flirtation with this other subject, and then you end up wasting time because you're by the time you figure out what you want to do, you're oh no, why did I take those classes in this area that I didn't actually need? Yeah. Or maybe I'm only speaking of personal experience, because I definitely sat around in some geology classes that I was why am I in here? I don't want this. I don't need this. So that ended up being quite interesting. So, okay, so once you were in it and this is what you knew you wanted to do, how did you go about, picking what to specialize in? Did you like a lot of things, and was it difficult to pare it down, or did you also always kind of know, I'm interested in this subsection?
I don't understand why it worked out as effectively as it did and consistently as it did. But I wouldn't say I always knew, but I was sort of interested. Like I didn't always know which precise authors and precisely which periods, but I was always interested in like probably two or three like core ideas and ways of reading. And I remember even for my graduate applications, I took a year off after undergrad, which I recommend to anybody. I've never heard anybody regret taking time off, but I have heard people regret going directly to graduate school from undergrad. And I took time off and I like worked in a bookstore and I kept reading Latin and occasionally some Greek. And I had written in my graduate applications about, I outlined what some of my interests were. And they were actually not too different than what I ended up doing, even though I went by some other routes. One of the things I was most interested in, reflecting my original love of poetry in English, was Roman love poetry in particular, because in some ways, I think with some of the famous Roman poets from the kind of who identified as classical, so from the late Republic in the 90s through the early first century CE, late Republic 90s BC to early first century CE, Catullus, Virgil, Lucretius. These are those poets, but the love poets in particular who I was interested in were Catullus and Propertius. Yeah, I think because those poets are poets who kind of sort of started a trend of kind of emotional agitation and expressive writing that was just really expressive of inner states, which is kind of what we think of as like poetry as being today, even though ancients had a much broader idea of poetry, including narrative and other things. So those were the poets I was really into because it most resembled the stuff that I was interested in on the modern side. And they also all dealt with gender and sexuality, of course, because they were love poets. And ancients are just a little more open about that stuff than we are, at least a little, if not a lot. So I knew I wanted to do that when I went to graduate school. And I also was interested in, but I'm not sure why, much later stuff. So like kind of Christianity in like the 4th century CE. There's a lot of poetry there that revives a lot of those old forms, old from the classical period. But then I think I just liked the obscurity of it. Honestly, I think I just liked it because it seemed like the stuff that nobody else liked. Everybody liked the love poetry, which I liked. But then there was this other stuff that nobody liked. So I always knew that I wanted to work on those two things. Eventually, I ended up working, actually, not at all, in my professional work as I began to publish stuff on the earlier love poetry stuff. I even perversely sort of don't like, or I say I don't like, some of the most famous poets of that kind of period, like Ovid and stuff like that. Because everybody always thinks Ovid, this love poet, is so ironic and clever that he's, secretly a feminist or something like that. And I thought that was all like, I thought that was just special pleading on his behalf. And so I kind of ended up eventually skipping all of that stuff. And yeah, and then now I work on Christian stuff as well as kind of on the way. I work on Roman philosophy as well. So that none of that actually sounds coherent now as I talk about it, but it felt very coherent. I guess there was a shift that happened from the love poetry because of its relationship to the modern poetry that I liked. And also because a lot of the most critical and sophisticated scholarship was being done on it. The scholarship that questioned the values that poetry purported, especially by feminists, was being done. And that was what I was interested in. But then I found, and this goes back to, some of the things I would say about some of the other poets of the classical period, like Ovid, that you had to work really hard to make this poetry say these things that we might find like more palatable or politically or morally congenial. But then there were these other writers, particularly philosophical writers in the Roman tradition. The one person I ended up working on was this philosopher Seneca from the time of Nero in the mid-1st century CE, who, because they were writing philosophy, just sort of said critically the types of things that a lot of other scholars were trying to make the other poets say. And so then I just got excited to work on that because it felt like I could have conversations with those writers, the ancient writers, more directly. And then through that, I kind of came back to the Christian stuff that I knew I wanted to work on because there's more continuities between the philosophers and the later Christian stuff because of the ethical concerns of Christianity than there is between the earlier stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Also, I mean, when you were saying about the love poets, I was like, they sound like they invented the angsty
Yeah.
genre. So to me, I guess, And maybe it's just growing up when I did, but like it tracks. I'm like, if you like poetry, especially love poetry, it's like implied that you would be drawn to sort of the angsty language that is
Mhm.
used. And then it's interesting because you can look at sort of today's angsty anything, right? And see parallels like, oh, okay, if these ancient people were going through the same angsty things, but they were using different words and expressions, but like you could find a great parallel with, what is an angsty person in ancient Rome thinking about and what words are they using? And would this sort of mirror like the kinds of things that I don't know, some kid like growing up in the early 2000s would listen to like Fall Out Boy and be like, oh, it's so angsty. Now I'm thinking about this, that, and the other thing.
I mean, you don't even have to go too obscure, right? It's like that love poetry. One of the reasons why I continue to like teaching it in particular is because it kind of codifies a lot of the ways of talking and feeling relating to angst and whatnot that, like Taylor Swift songs have. Like it's all like the same formula and like all the like romance stuff. And then it becomes not a coincidence that romance actually is derived from Roman because I think, starting in like I don't know, in the Middle Ages and stuff, when people started reviving some of those old forms of erotic language for like, knights and courtly poetry and stuff, they referred to it as Romanesque or something like that. That's what gave rise to our idea of romantic. So even like the idea of a story, in modern romance languages, the word for novel is roman in many instances. And that's because there's something Romanesque about the very idea of a story. Earlier stories of those kinds tended to be about like somebody pursuing someone who was in distress and, suffering on the way and all of that. So it all kind of connects together. Yeah.
I'm curious. You've gotten to look at a lot of different poets and stuff and their work. So do you have a single favorite poem, or is that just way too hard to choose one? Is it like asking you to, pick a favorite child?
I don't know if I could pick one poem. I could pick one poet. So my original favorite poet was this Propertius, who was this Roman love poet who wrote a bunch of poems about a woman named Cynthia. I talk about this. I teach a class on called Sex and Power about sexuality and often violence and the way that they're connected in the Roman world. And we read stuff about modern experiences of those things too. I teach some of that stuff Propertius, and I often talk in that class about how reading it today, I'm kind of scandalized that I liked it. Because now it seems like so overtly troubling and the connection of like the violent and the erotic. And I knew there was something wrong about it when I liked it. And I think that was why I gravitated towards the kind of scholarship and criticism. But I guess if I were to pick one of the things that interests me the most of that material, at least, would be like amongst my favorites. It's really very immediate with this poet. Like the first three poems of his first book, he wrote like four books, and the first three poems of the first book are like this little unit where he talks about being in this kind of like volatile and often unrequited romantic situation with this woman. Then there's a poem, second poem, where he talks about it's like really codifies objectification of women. It's just like he goes through her whole anatomy and like the way she dresses and talks about her. What he does that's really interesting is that he kind of keeps comparing her to these really dense and obscure mythological images and stuff like that. So it sort of raises this question of like whether he's actually talking about her or whether he's actually talking about like the stories that he associates her with. The upshot of that poem, which is very characteristically clever of the poets in this period, is that at the end he's like, well, you're so attractive when you're essentially naked. You shouldn't have to wear lots of fancy clothes, and that's why I shouldn't have to give you money to buy nice clothes and buy you good things. And when you get to that point, you're like, there's something up here. It's nothing like this is not like, an open question at that point, certainly whether we should trust him as a speaker. But then also to another extent, I mean, he is objectifying her, certainly, but is he even actually really talking about a woman, or is he just talking about, myths and poetry and aesthetics and beauty and things like that? So she kind of disappears. And then the third poem, which is probably one of my favorites, I think, is when he is like, it's just him, it's like kind of a scene of him being drunk, and it's a monologue of him coming in. And this is the part that's quite disturbing, particularly now. And he like comes in and she's asleep one night, and then he starts like manipulating her body with like putting an apple that he brought for her and like giving it like to hold, and it falls down. And like then he starts like worrying if she's dreaming about other people. So it's very obsessive, erotic sort of stuff. But then at the end of the poem, something kind of unprecedented in classical literature to that point happens, which is that she wakes up and she gets really mad at him, and the poem ends with a monologue of hers. And I remember reading that. That's like, I was like really excited because there's a lot of problems there. Like, it's not clear that it ever escapes objectification, and it's not clear that we're certainly not getting like a real woman's voice from this tradition, which is somewhat overtly misogynistic at this point, at least in this, even the circumscribed set that I've provided of these three poems. Something about that whole system of objectifying, and maybe even implicitly, there's a degree of like violence, or at least non-consent, when he comes in and finds her asleep. Somehow in that system, the woman's voice emerges in spite of the system in some way. And that to me, that reversal of power relations, that was always a really exciting thing. It was like, it's, I would, well, I'll say, and then I'll immediately qualify it. It's like, maybe there's a promise of like redemption of the tradition from its otherwise wholly misogynistic orientation, and that something about it still provides women's voice. And what I'll say to qualify that is, and this is what a lot of the sophisticated scholarship that I was most interested in represented and showed, it's kind of naive to think she's actually speaking in some way, or he's faithfully recording a real encounter, rather than just continuing to stage somebody who is like opposes him, whom he can then override, and then be opposed again, and then dramatize all of his own emotions, and then it's really just all about him, and it never was really about her to begin with. And there's a famous piece, a work of scholarship by a woman named Gold. It refers to some of the poetry from this tradition and its engagement with mythology, and it's called "But Ariadne Was Never There in the First Place." So it's like, it's in these poems where there'll be these mythical images of Andromache and Ariadne and stuff like that. It was never actually about women. So we should never think about it as being somewhat, countercultural against Roman masculinity. But all of that's there. And I think that's what's really exciting. There's always the potential that could have been there. And that's an exciting thing.
Huh. No, I'm learning so much just because I will admit to one, I was a Hellenist and I did not like the Roman stuff at all. I was like, no, goodbye Rome. So I like took 2 classes on Rome the whole time I was in school. Perhaps bad. And second, it's different from a lot of the stuff that I remember going over, especially in the Greeks. And so I am curious, like I clearly can see how curious and interested you are in the Roman poetry. Did you ever feel like the same sense of curiosity on the Greek side? Did you go through a class or a phase where you just got into reading like a lot of Sappho and you're like, what does this say? Or did you kind of skip that and you're like, nah?
No, I did go through phases where I like Greek poetry. So one thing, I don't know, I won't speak for all people who work on Roman stuff, but it's tempting, let me say, as a Romanist, to have a chip on your shoulder about Greeks, right? Because everybody always thinks that the Greeks were so sublime and original and all of that. Even some of my later work has been more on philosophy, and particularly Roman philosophy. So authors like whom I mentioned earlier, Lucretius, the great Roman statesman and orator, Cicero in the Republic, and then Seneca, whom I mentioned before, from the 1st century CE and the Neronian period. They all wrote philosophy in Latin, Roman philosophy. But I always joke that when I tell people who work on philosophy, for instance, that I work on Roman philosophy, they'll say things like, oh, I didn't know there was any, so there's that. And certainly that's true in philosophy. And then it's also, we have like the Aeneid by Virgil, right, on the Roman side, which like, most people love. And we have Ovid, who's just so like perverse and clever and, so comprehensive and ambitious in his like encompassing of like all myth that it's hard not to like him. So we have those, but then everybody loves Greek tragedy, and everybody talks about like Plato and Aristotle are like the most important poets, even though for a lot of like later in early modernity, like in the 14, 15, 1600s, 1700s and stuff like that, I don't know. I don't personally think that early modern philosophy, like John Locke, like the people who, like, the founders, so-called founders of the United States, are reading and crafting democracy through and everything. They were only reading, as far as I know, really Cicero and Seneca. They were only reading Roman stuff. But then something happened, like, I don't know, I think Germans in the 19th century had this idea that we like have to go back to the source. There may have even been something where like the French associated themselves with the Romans because French is a Romance language. And so the Germans wanted to like say like, no, it's like there's some weird rivalry between modern European states. It's actually the Greeks who are like more authentic. And then German classicism gave forth all these ideas about like classical beauty and immutable immortal values. But really, for the most part, it was all Roman stuff. Like that really like constructed modernity in a lot of ways. But then suddenly in the 19th century, like everybody just, it's like, it was all about Greeks. But of course, to get back to your question, at the beginning of it all, there's Homer, who everybody loves, and I like teaching Homer, but I kind of have a chip on my shoulder about Homer for the reasons that I just outlined about just the Greeks versus Roman thing. And then there's Sappho, who I don't have a chip on my shoulder about. Like I like Sappho. Like Sappho, it's like impossible. Like I don't know who wouldn't like Sappho. Like it seems like only somebody who was a jerk, you know, or maybe a misogynist, like an inveterate misogynist wouldn't like, or perhaps a homophobe wouldn't like Sappho. Like only, it's a little hard to read because it's not in classical Greek; it's in a dialect, which is a little quirky. But yeah, she's great. And in fact, all the poets that I mentioned, Catullus, the Roman poet, and Propertius, and that poem that I talked about, where Propertius's mistress, this woman Cynthia, speaks for herself. They all seem to be actually, if you read the Latin closely, it all connects really closely with Sappho's Greek, even including the fact that Catullus translated one of her poems in a very influential way. And so there was a way in which Sappho is like the secret female voice of Roman poetry that, because they were so into her poetry in the love context and the erotic context of poetry and kept reproducing Sappho in one way or another, even though they were probably doing it for really misogynistic ends to try to control women, the influence and the force of Sappho somehow escaped their efforts. And so yeah, I love that stuff. And I loved for the same reasons I talked about before, like Greek lyric poetry, like of which Sappho is one representative of this broader genre. And there's all this music in it. It's like metrical, and it takes forever to understand because the meter is really complicated, and even the experts all argue really strenuously as if each of their interpretations is correct, but like of how we should read and pronounce these poems to make them sound the way they originally sounded. But we can't know. And it's always this thing in classical and ancient stuff where like the less we can know about something, the more fervently people argue about it. It's like because you just don't want to give up, I guess, right? We just don't want to give up on the possibility that we could reconstruct it. So I loved reading all of that stuff. But it was one of those things. I remember in grad school one time, there's this Greek lyric poet who's kind of at the end of the archaic tradition that Sappho's firmly in the middle of, named Pindar, who wrote these poems that are just like so difficult to understand. And they're all like difficult to understand on purpose because it's all about like athletic performance and excellence of individuals rising to supremacy above their community. And the poem praises the athlete. But because the athlete does things that no one else can do, the poem has to be something that only someone as good as an athlete is strong could like understand it. And it's like the way he writes, I've also thought it's like if aliens came down and like gave like us poetry the way people talk about aliens like helping to build the pyramids or something, like Pindar would be the result. And I remember in grad school when I was reading it, I would like have these moments of like extraordinary understanding where suddenly I would understand like a stanza, like it would all come together because it's really hard to understand. And then I would be like, this is incredible. And then like an hour later, I would look at it again. I'd be like, I have no idea what this is saying. So like there was I had a desire to like keep doing that, like to study Pindar or something like that. But then a practical, I don't know if we could talk about practical at this point, but a practical side of me started to be like, like if you want to like say stuff, which you kind of have to do if you want to like be a scholar and a teacher, It'll probably be better to just work on the stuff where they just kind of tell you what they're doing. And that's why I got into the philosophy stuff. And that's even why I like the later Christian stuff, because they're all just more direct. They just say, like what they're talking about. So it was easier to meet those people. But I was always like, yeah, I always loved that side of the Greeks, that they're just inscrutable and other. And, it's very, it's great. And I like teaching it. I don't get to teach Greek very often because of the way our programs are structured. And when I do, one of my favorite authors to teach is actually Plato, the philosopher, and especially his work. He has some works on poetry and rhetoric, the Phaedrus, as well as the Symposium, which is about the erotic experience. And that's probably an important text for understanding the love poetry and a lot about gender and sexuality. And so I really like teaching those. And I get a little bit of like what I used to get in graduate school from Plato. There's this famous quote somewhere, I forget where, Cicero, the orator, we have a lot of his letters. And in one of his letters, he says something like, it's shocking. But this is kind of why I like them, not because he says what I'm about to say, but because it's like they actually say the things. Romans tend to say the things that we were all thinking that the Greeks never came out and said. And I like that. Cicero says, like, even if I had like a whole other life to live, I would never read the Greek lyric poets. I don't agree with that. Like, I would love to, if I had another life to live, read the Greek lyric poets, but I am sympathetic with that. I understand like how hard and challenging it is. And, and let me say, some of my best friends work on Greek lyric poetry. But yeah, I do feel that it's a little bit hard. And I like that the Romans sometimes just say, things like that. They just come out and say it.
I just love that poetry seems to, like, I've noticed it's like a kind of reoccurring theme where if you are an expert and do any kind of literature or poetry, there are like really set strong opinions on the Greeks versus the Romans, instead of say something that by nature it has to be a bit more open, a little more interdisciplinary, because there's not room, right, to have such big opinions. But I always kind of laugh when I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get some big opinions, because it's someone who's gonna firmly place themselves on one side of who wrote the better stuff,
right?
If you can say such a thing, because obviously you can't compare. It's as we're told, it's like comparing apples to oranges. You can't. It's funny. See, as you're mentioning the various authors and their works, I'm like, oh, yes, okay, vaguely remember talking about this person and this person. And it's funny because I don't remember specifics from my time as an undergrad, but what I do remember is the feelings that I had that this evokes, right? So when you say, like, Pindar, you say Catullus, I just go, oh, I remember feeling like, oh no, not another one of these, and then if you say like Euripides, I remember going, oh yes, and I was excited to go to that class because then we talked about something crazy. Yeah, poetry's a wide, crazy world there. So, but I am curious because I saw somewhere that you also get into queer theory.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so that, I think if you said that to most people, they would probably think, oh, that's like a really contemporary, within the last, I don't know, 10 years, whatever sort of subject that seems right, like a new avenue. But yeah, I had no classes that covered that in undergrad, which was very, very sad. So how do you teach it? I'm curious to see how you approach teaching a class on that, especially as an expert with the ancient Roman stuff.
Queer theory, or studies of sexualities that are not heterosexual and based on reproduction, which would be one way of thinking about it, which also opens up into the study of gender, which isn't, either male or female, escapes the binary. In its historical development as a field in the late 20th century, drew really dramatically on ancient Greek and Roman culture. Some of the pioneering texts, one could argue, amongst others, in queer theory and or what had been called at times sort of gay and lesbian studies, drew on ancient Greek and Roman stuff because, for the obvious reason that especially in Greek texts, there's a very clear emphasis on male-male erotic relationships. Poetry is unequivocal, the poetry that we were discussing before, about the desirability of people of either gender, male or female, as they would have understood it, And it's almost always, with the exception of occasional exceptions like Sappho, from a male perspective. And so necessarily it becomes a poetry that looks like it is homosexual, or that is to say, oriented around male sexuality, at least. And then Sappho, of course, does the same thing with women, or at least younger women, arguably girls. And there's a whole interesting issue here about the age difference and the way that, that a lot of this poetry and discourse on the Greek side in particular, but also on the Roman side, is about real asymmetrical age differences of like the erotic, older, desiring speaker of the poem desires usually like a teenager, and they could be whatever age. Like Socrates is really old, so that there's a whole interesting history about whether or not that radical asymmetry in age was part of the formative influence of Greco-Roman culture on late 20th century gay and lesbian studies then, and also queer theory then and now. But regardless of the specifics of the age issue, which is a big one, there is a combating this idea that heterosexual sex may be pleasurable, but primarily designed for procreation, is somehow universal and natural. That idea can't withstand comparison with these classical texts, which show that that wasn't even a concern for them, right? That for them, it was just as easy, at least in some of the contexts that we can reconstruct, primarily around classical Athens, but also with the lyric poetry, to imagine an individual engaged in procreative, what we would call heterosexual sex, in a marriage, as I'm sure is kind of an economic relationship in the ancient world more than an emotional one. People got married for a whole bunch of arranged reasons that had to do with their families and the household wealth and things like that, and reproducing children to have somebody to leave the wealth to. That was like the primary motive of marriage. And then they had, at the same time, the same individual would have this like kind of maybe wild emotional life involving all types of individuals of the same sex. Archetypally, it would be an older man and a younger male, or a youth of some kind. But then we even see, in Plato and things like that, very open and affectionate, flirtatious relationships between men of the same age and status, though they don't ever talk about having outright sex. That's all there. So those texts were really, really essential to all those Greek texts in particular, were really essential to kind of debunking a lot of the received understanding in the 19th to 20th century of sexuality as binary, male, female, and procreative in its orientation. So they were really important for all of that. And then on the Roman side, I was just talking about the Greek side, then you get all of this really remarkable stuff, kind of consistent with what I was talking about before with Roman love poetry and the way it sometimes objectifies women, but also gives some kind of voice to them. You have in texts like the famous novel, The Satyricon by Petronius, which was also written in the 1st century CE, obvious references to male sexuality between sort of age asymmetrical pairs, an older guy and a youth, a young man, or, older quote unquote boy, where in fact the younger character is actually a really important figure in the novel who talks and has subjectivity and preferences about different lovers. Just like before, it's all very possible that this is a society that was, based on the objectification and domination of young people by older people. That is probably all true. And it's only the old people who are writing the story about the young people expressing their erotic preferences and their agency and intelligence and cleverness in the context of a novel. But still, even within that system, right, they're saying things. These objects of other people's desire are saying things and, talking about their experiences. Roman poets of later contexts, satirical poets like the poet Juvenal, who is writing in between kind of from the 1st century CE to the 2nd century CE, around 100, let's say. He has a couple of poems that give these really long, mocking, derisive, and we would say homophobic treatments of same-sex sexual relations, including same-sex marriages between men, where men adopt different gender identities and things like that. And it's all mocking and berating those people. But it's possible, right, that he's actually mocking and berating people who had a particular subculture or experience apart from the poem, in which if we could have heard from them, we might have had a very different view. But we at least, even in the form of the mockery, have some of the evidence of that. Now, again, that could be very naive. Some people will come in and say, none of that's real, for instance, that all of that description of same-sex sexual behaviors, it's really just elite dominant men making fun of other elite dominant men by ascribing lots of horrible attributes to them. It's like really horrible things, like being a woman, the way they would present it in their minds, right? And that could be true. It could be that, in fact, this doesn't correspond to any social reality at all. But it's probably more likely that it's somewhere in the middle, that they're mocking and using figures of disdain, whom they choose to degrade, as a way of kind of negotiating their own identity among themselves. But those people still existed. And, we don't have evidence, concrete evidence in the literary record of their experience, but we might have it in other places. And, people who do work on graffiti and things like that in Pompeii and brothels and stuff can make very good arguments based on some of the evidence there that some of the people who the elites are mocking and deriding in their like weird inter-elite conflicts where they kind of make fun of everybody else to make themselves feel better about themselves, might actually be preserved somewhat in their own voices in the graffiti. And that supports the point that maybe there were actually subcultures there. So I guess one of the things that always strikes me is that I like so much is how the alternative sexualities or identities of gender, whether it's like women who are, often dominated individuals, or people who are invested in certain types of same-sex sexual behavior or gender variance in the ancient world that wouldn't have been socially acceptable there, how it shows through the record, even if it shows through kind of ugly stuff and you need to have a sort of strong moral stomach to deal with it. I do think it's to the credit of the Romans, more so than the Greeks, I guess, and this is a very dubious backhanded compliment to them, that they were so open with insult and mockery and derision that they didn't hide a bunch of people's experience. Granted, they only showed it to us so that they could deride it, but if we look hard enough, we can still see evidence of it across the board, some level of it. And I think that's, it's a very dubious praise of them, that they were such jerks they wouldn't shy away from insulting anybody. But because they would insult anybody and felt the need to insult anybody and everybody who is different, we actually do have some evidence of people who otherwise, didn't leave any or left very little trace in the historical record.
I mean, if anything, I guess you can really say there is some perverse beauty in being, derisive and making a mockery of people.
Yeah, everything, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, well, I suppose that also holds up for today's culture. I mean, I guess every time, right, there's like a new political scandal in the last 20 years, right, we bring it up because the intent is to mock people for stuff. But at the same time, you then hear of like crime or other weird things people have done, and you're like, I don't know, maybe it's because like I worked in politics for a little bit, but I'm like, oh my god, though, that holds so true, because like every sort of mistress scandal, right, you're like, and now we bring it up, look at how terrible they are, they had the mistress and they're like paying her to like not do this or that or whatever, and then you're like, oh, but look how much we've just uncovered. But it's a bit crazy, right, how like all these ancient parallels come back and we see them full force, like going strong in the modern era, and you're like, we're not that different from them.
Yeah, I mean, and what's really common between the ancient and the modern, and what you just mentioned, is how in all the instances you see that people's private lives and sexuality come into public, and when they do, it's not really about directly, it's not coming into public specifically because we're interested in people's private lives and sexuality in their own right, in like a scholarly way or something like that, or a sociological way. It's coming in as a way of dealing with other issues, so politics or something like that, which is about political conflict, ideology, and fighting over resources that are scarce necessarily or unnecessarily scarce. And then you kind of like bring in sexuality and stuff like that, and sexual scandals as alternative forums to argue about that, where you think you might have better like traction or something like that against an enemy. That's definitely what the Romans were doing. But the difference between today and then is that today we actually do have the voices of all kinds of people of all types of different backgrounds and orientations and things like that. And yet it's still the case that a certain minority of individuals dominate discourse. Whereas in antiquity, at least with the evidence such as it is, we don't only, this is what people would argue about, but we have a lot of primarily elite dominant language and representations of sexuality from an elite minority's perspective, and very little other evidence. But people would argue about the extent to which that's true. Some people would say, like with the graffiti I mentioned before, and lots of references to other places in Greek culture and Roman culture, we have more evidence than we think. We just haven't been looking for it. We do have, in modernity, people fortunately do speak on their own behalf as members of groups, whereas in antiquity it's really one group speaking for everybody else in a classic kind of form of domination.
It's weird because, like, the more I think about that aspect of it, right? I guess the most contemporary thing I can think of, and maybe it's because I read an article about it the other day. I know right now in the GOP primary, they're making a really big deal out of Senator Tim Scott, and not for any of the reasons that he would want to make headlines, right? They're bringing up the fact that he is the only single candidate on their side, and that he's black.
Mm.
And it's interesting because he had his PR machine essentially put out, like, you don't care about my girlfriend, who he refuses to, like, introduce or show anyone. But he's like, I have a girlfriend, but this is not why you're attacking me about being single and unmarried. He's like, you're attacking me because it's a veiled threat at me being black. But, you know, people can debate that until, you know, they're blue in the face, and we can't really say. But it's interesting how they're framing it in terms of the marital status, right? And the show us your girlfriend. No, I'm choosing to keep her out of the spotlight. Okay, well then you must be lying. You know, it's quite interesting that we still have these kind of things that I feel like we might be likely to see in antiquity, these same sort of arguments and battles, just framed in a different way. You know, I don't know.
Yeah,
but maybe it's more acceptable back then. I don't know. Because I feel like, you know, ancient Greeks would probably be like, oh, yeah, I visited like the Porneon in Corinth the other day. Like, it's all good. There's nothing wrong here. Yeah, no one would be like, yeah, I went to the Porneon the other day. Today, certainly not. And especially not in positions of power, the upper echelon of society or whatever. So it's a bit bonkers to think about. But I did want to bring in the sort of later stuff that you do. I know in the later stuff that you have been working a little bit on approaches to like death. And so I'm just really curious because it was something that I was like, wait, how does he weave death into all this?
I've done a little stuff with teaching in relation to death, but my interest actually in that actually comes, it's more of a byproduct of my interest in Christianity, in the emergence of Christianity in the Roman context. Because, you know, Christianity is compared with some of the other, at the time, contemporary religions, ranging from Judaism to, you know, other cultic religions, you know, followers of Mithraism and other cults in the time, Isis religion and stuff like that. Well, actually, I was about to say that Christianity is really preoccupied with death in comparison with those religions, but on reflection, at least in terms of some of the cults like Isis religion and stuff like that, they're actually a lot about death too. So I guess the point of this is that my interest in death is kind of a byproduct of my interest in late antique, what people call late antique Christianity. And so because regardless of how it compares to other religions of the time, late antique Christianity is at some level centered around death because of the death of Christ and then apparent resurrection as purported in the sources, right? That becomes a big, you know, it kind of gets in, as it were, death gets a new lease on life as an important symbol to think through things. So my interest in death is kind of related to my interest in Christianity. And I would say, I guess to refine what I was saying before, Christianity isn't more about death than some of its contemporary religions, but it's like some of them a lot about death. And so that's kind of where it came from. One thing that interested me and is related to some of my work in the Roman context there is the idea of people in Roman studies referred to as exemplarity. This idea that there are certain ideal models of behavior that we can find in culture and history. ranging from myth to actual historical individuals. And Romans use this a lot. They invoke exempla a lot, saying, like, this great Roman statesman acted this way in this context, so I'm going to act in a comparable way in this new context, following his example. And one of the kind of privileged topics of exemplarity will be death in the ancient world. And in some ways, when you look at sort of, I guess, what we could call, I suppose, later Christian writing being produced after the production of the Gospels in Greek in the course of the 1st century CE, if you start looking into the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, at Christian accounts of martyrdom, particularly in Latin as opposed to Greek, this idea of exemplarity and the Latin word exemplum, from which we get example, obviously, starts to appear in descriptions of exemplary deaths. And so for them, there's a kind of ethical issue about how we deal with all kinds of things in life by following models. And in particular, they find death to be one that they deal with a lot. And so I taught a class, for instance, about the difference between pre-Christian or pagan representations of death and Christian representations of death. And actually, the difference it's not as dramatic as you would think. There are some, but that's what I wanted to figure out when I taught the class. And so that's kind of, we looked at comparisons of those different ideas. And that was about exemplarity and ethics.
Oh, that's so cool. I like that sort of different spin on it. I feel like, it'd be kind of easy to fall into, let's just look at death and sort of I don't know, I want to say sort of more frontal way. Still one of those kind of taboo subjects, which, like, okay, I get it. But also it's interesting because, like, yeah, when you think of, like, a lot of ancient cultures, like, they have a really in-depth, interesting visualization of, like, what the afterlife, underworld, whatever you want to call it, would look like. And I think, it must have been quite comforting, right? If you're an ancient person and you're like, oh yes, well, I can go to my Elysian fields and I will be happy and in sunlight forever. But it's interesting because, once Christianity comes in, and then once people are like, okay, well, there's rings of hell and there's fire and devils, and then everyone's suddenly like, this is terrible, I don't want to talk about it, I'm, like, afraid now. And you're like, whoa, how do we go from, like, beautiful fields? I mean, it wasn't all, like, rainbows and sunshine, of course. If you were, a bad king or bad person, you would maybe go somewhere else. Or if you just died as, like, the epic ultimate sad person, you would, like, end up in the fields of mourning and then be stuck there. Like, of course, bad things could happen. But the transition has always been very interesting to think about because I'm like, it was not taboo.
The ideas of exemplary deaths and, like, how people die and what that says about how they lived, the example they pose in dying. I think maybe, I don't know, this is getting what you're talking about. You're talking about, like, I mean, it gets into, like, Dante and stuff, so it's later than what I know about. I think probably that's, like, that a lot of those changes in culture and more anxiety around death and stuff like that, to the point that one wouldn't talk about it. I mean, there's plenty of anxiety around death in antiquity. They just talk about it a lot to deal with their anxiety, whereas in modernity, there's less. I think that was probably hashed out through representations, through repeated representations of people dying in exemplary ways, and, like, what that says and what the stakes of dying and how you die are. And yeah, what you're saying is, like, somewhere along the line it started to get, like,
Crazy.
Yeah, less hopeful, maybe, or not hopeful, I don't know. I mean, because Christianity is predicated on hope, of course. The immortality of the soul is they think of it as a hopeful thing.
I mean, the turn is interesting, right? Because in antiquity, a lot of you associated going down with not being bad, and then suddenly Christianity kind of comes in, and then slowly there's a change, and everyone wants to go up because everything down is bad, and there's, and you're like, oh, okay, well, that changed a lot. And
yeah, I guess that's it. So it's like that black and white, good or bad attribution of, yeah.
Yes, like this black and white kind of thinking about it came in at some point, and then suddenly everyone was like, yes, this must be true. And then suddenly it's black and white, and you're like, wait. But yeah, I don't know, like, outside of, like, the ancient Mediterranean, though, I'm like, I'm sure Vikings had these great ideas about exemplary deaths when their entire, like, afterlife is predicated on let's go feast and fight all day, in this glorious afterlife as we prepare for the big battle. So you're like, oh, okay, so, like, you couldn't end up in Valhalla unless your death was exemplary in some way anyway.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
different region, different culture, different beliefs. It's so interesting to me how like so many cultures, they share a lot of things, and then others are like so vastly different, and it like persists. And like I guess like the development of these ideas also is really of interest. Like I was reading a book just the other day, and it was telling me that like the ancient, well, not even ancient, but like the modern Chinese perception, right, of kind of like the afterlife is like bureaucracy, right? They're like, oh, it's like this book was like, oh yes, it's all paperwork, and you're gonna be buried in paperwork, and it's not fun. So you need to have like everything because you're gonna like not get through. It's like the world's most complex customs, right? Like thing, and I was like, that does not sound fun. How did that come up? You know? And you're like, what? So it's a very big, very interesting topic. But yeah, I wish it weren't so taboo these days, and I'm not really sure how we change that. I mean, you could talk about it more, but then people just kind of tune you out because they're like, no, you're spreading bad vibes, I don't want it. And yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, I think. Anyway, I could probably find 5 or 6 or 7 or 1,000 more ways that I could spiral this conversation, but I think you and I would die of old age actually before we got through all these topics. So I unfortunately have to shove us along. And so there are a couple of questions that I usually ask to end the interview portion of the podcast. And the first one is, when you were a student, either undergrad or grad student, did you attend office hours, both either informally or formally?
I mean, office hours are a funny thing, right? Because, like, a lot of times my colleagues and I will talk about how we'll just be, my office hour, I'll just be in my office and it comes and goes. And I didn't even realize it happened. I was just there, nobody came. And I encourage students to come to office hours for anything at all. And I think most of my colleagues too like it. Usually what happens if a student comes to office hour is it interrupts you writing email. And I don't know, maybe other people do that. I don't really, writing email isn't my primary fun thing to do. Like, I'd much rather talk with somebody about stuff that I care about than write an email about some administrative issue. So, people will come in and be like, oh, I'm sorry, you look busy. And it's like, I am happy to drop this and talk with you about anything relating to this class or anything else right now compared with what the email that I'm writing. So yeah, but then people don't. And I have to say, when I was when I was an undergrad, I was kind of apprehensive about office hours. I didn't really go to office hours a lot. I even remember missing an office hour where I'd made an appointment a couple of instances because of anxiety around seeing my professor and everything. Other appointments that I had with different professors, yeah, where I thought, I guess I kind of thought if I got like a B on something or a C on something, that professor would be not like me and would remember it and know that. What I now know is that I don't remember anybody's grades as a professor. So if that's a fear, of how you're doing in the class, and that's going to lead to my reaction to you, it's very likely that I have a general sense of how you're doing in the class, but I have no strong feelings about it. And I certainly don't know of any of the details unless I look at my grade book. It's not at the forefront of my mind. So if that's something that's holding people back, they should just come to the office hour and talk.
Your 30-second pitch is, come to office hours because I don't want to do email. So please come distract me and don't be scared.
Don't be scared because whatever it is you think I'm paying attention to, I'm probably not. Because I have all this email. I have to write all this emails.
Oh, of course. No, it's so true.
How can I remember grades? That's why I have a grade book.
I mean, well, it's down to even other things. I'm fond now, but not so fond at the time. Memory I have is I sat in the first row, kind of in the middle, all semester long. And then the day of the final, right? So the day you don't want anything to happen, I got to class maybe 5 minutes before the start, and someone was in my seat. And now I was like, do I go say something? Do I be like, hey, do you mind moving? Because I sat here all semester. And also it is key to me remembering things, because it's proven that if you sit consistently in the same spot, you'll start to attach learning techniques to, oh, okay, they wrote this and I was at this angle. And so I remember when they sort of moved 2 steps over and then they're in front of the thing. I was like, okay, maybe they'll say something. And then I was like, I don't know if my professor actually even noticed I was like sitting in the same row. Like, do they actually notice front row students? And it was funny because at the time I was like, no, he's probably not going to care. So I like sat in the back and I still did fine on my final, but I remember thinking I could have done like better if I was sitting in my seat. And then I went like later and I talked to my professor and he was kind of like, oh yeah, I really actually didn't know if you like came to the final or missed it because you weren't in your seat. And I was like, I was in the back. And he was like, oh, right.
The seating, we definitely notice seating, right?
At least in the
That's
first
because
two rows, right?
I mean, just because that's like it's like you're saying the like situational learning or like physical learning in the situation. Like that's how you know people's names, and that's how you remember who's interested in what. And if somebody moves to a different place, then you're like, but somebody who sits over there who's usually interested in gender, but now you're talking about class. You're supposed to be over here, you know. So okay, I don't know how to now. I'm kind of reconfigure answer. So that we remember, but like usually how somebody's actually something that you might think of as more substantial and meaningful, like your success in the class. We care about it, but we just want to chat about what
Exactly.
we like. We're
Exactly.
not that concerned about that. Yeah, and we're concerned to help you do better. But like if you're not performing to your personal all-time best, that's like not the first thing we think of when we see you or don't see you in a place.
Well, I'm sure also it probably depends on the size of the class. Because if it's like a small upper level class where you only maybe have 15 to 20, it's super easy to remember where people sit. But I'm always a little shocked. Like, would professors remember people if you're like teaching, big, freshman level class with like 400 students? And I've come to I've talked with enough people to confidently or semi-confidently say, I feel like you guys will remember at least the first two rows, and then beyond that you're like, I can't see, I can't remember. Nope, only my first
Like
two row people. But also it's also the people in the first two rows that are the most, they care the most about seating, right? Because you're like, you care and you want the same spot. If you're beyond the first two rows, I feel like you're like, okay, whatever, I'll sit, I don't care anywhere.
I mean, the people in the back might care about seeing, but they care about being in the back, I think.
Yeah. Well, you either care in the front or the back because you want to hide. But I'm also like, I guarantee if you're in like a massive class with like 400 students, no one's gonna care other than you about being in the back. Like they won't see you, they don't know you. It's fine.
What I will say is that I was at an event with all just faculty recently, and most of the people were sitting in the back of the room. So it's not, and then sometimes like somebody will like make a joke about it being like a class and that they want people to, and nobody ever moves when they make that joke about everybody coming to the front of the room. So I think they were just, it's not about your relative position. I think this is just maybe like in those types of rooms, we just want to be in the back, except some people want to be the front. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I guess that's when it really comes out. Like, okay, who's gonna be the center of attention? Who wants to be at the front? And you're like, no. Like, don't call on me. Don't even see me. I'm invisible. I'm gonna sit and blend. No, it's really interesting. Yeah, I was at a like a department welcome event, and like all the more senior professors were like, I'm gonna just sit in the back and like hide over here, and I don't want to be seen or really talked to unless I have to. But it's funny, yeah, our department, they like force everyone to take the mic and introduce themselves, so it's like you can't hide. But I'm sure in a different department where you don't have to force every single person to introduce themselves, then you can easily just sort of recede and be like, okay, I'm here but I'm not, and come talk to me later in my smaller pod. So okay, the second question is, you can pull from any point in your educational life experience teaching. Is there a specific conversation or experience or moment that particularly stands out to you from an office hour time? Something fun that happened or something that struck you?
There were some faculty in my grad school who were basically always at the office. And I would just go and see them about like, really like arcane classic stuff like we were talking about before, like how you understand rhythmical pronunciation of an ancient poem or something like that everybody debates about really vigorously because no one knows how to do it, and so they argue more strenuously that there's a right or a wrong way. I remember things like that, or like the kind of manuscript traditions, and like where there's at the bottom of pages of editions of Latin and Greek texts, there's all these like letters and numbers and Greek letters and symbols, and they all correspond to all the manuscripts that the editor used to like construct the text that you now see, because in the old days, right, where there wasn't print, everything was different. So there's slight differences. So they have to figure it all out. And there are whole subfields of classical studies and studies of ancient material that are dedicated those things. And it's always the case that people argue really strenuously about it. And they're very arcane and kind of unwelcoming to try to understand. And I remember a couple of instances of, or not even an office hour, just like the office where one of my professors was, and, asking about that. And I remember them being just, really happy about to like go to town on this like really obscure thing that they probably hadn't even thought about in 10 or 15 years or something like that technique of like, using that material. And I remember one time when me and a couple of my peers in grad school were like all huddled around this like text with one of our professors, looking at this is about the manuscript stuff at the bottom of the page where you try to reconstruct the relationship of all the texts and which one was copied from which. And there are these like in these critical editions, there are these trees that show like what text like graphic representations, charts at like in a tree form that show like what text was copied from what text at what time in the transmission of the manuscripts that came down to where we are. And those are called the plural is stemmata, and it's a stemma is like what that like representation of the text and their relationship to one another are. And I remember when we were all like two of three of us were like talking with one of our professors about it, and then another one came by and he was like, "What are you guys doing?" And we were like, "Well, we're looking at this thing and there's this manuscript question." And he said, well, there's nothing like a good stemma to get the blood boiling. And that was one of those moments where I was like, I would like the rest of my life to be like this. But like all those moments, they're few and far between, because like mostly I've got to write a bunch of email and there are deadlines and things, and students don't come to office hours anyway. And but anytime an undergrad or a grad comes in, and especially if it's about like a Latin or a Greek thing, and they're just like, I want to like, can you tell me like the commentary says that it's this is the way you understand the grammar in this phrase, but I was reading with so-and-so and we thought it was this other way. And then I look at it and like, I'm like, that's a good question, right? I think I might get more excited about it sometimes than the person. Sometimes I feel like, oh, I'm actually like, now I'm going too far. Like we've been talking about this for like 15 minutes and like they might just want to get back to like finishing the assignment, which is due tomorrow. But so I still get those moments, that's the kind of promise of the academic life, but they come few and far between.
But that's the joy when you do get to help the ones that come in and you're like, okay, I had a really fun time doing this. Yeah, that's the joy.
It might get tiresome if it was happening all the time, right? Because then you would never get anything else done. So it's probably good that it happens just every so often. It's like a golden moment.
Just wait until you get that one student who wants to live in your office hours.
Well, that's a different thing. Yeah.
That was me as a student. I absolutely lived in mine. So anyway, at the end of each podcast, though, I have every guest read Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And this is meant to be a cold reading. And this is a poem that has been cited as kind of influential or beautifully written. And I would just be very interested to hear whether you agree with this assessment and just, what do you think of the poem?
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stones stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal, these words appear. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
So, thoughts on the poem?
Well, I feel silly because I forgot. I mean, I know the poem, and just now, and when I brought it up before, I actually forgot that it goes on after "Look on my works, you mighty, and despair," because that's the line that everybody remembers. I was like, oh, there's 4 more lines, right? Because then it has to show that everything is like abandoned and destroyed, and how ironic it is. And I just assumed that part of it. I like this poem. This is the kind of stuff that I liked that got me into classics. I like reading it out loud because I like hearing the way the form of the poetry, the pronunciation works together in the meter, which is one of the things that I like. But now I have to say what I think of when I read this poem: the mall near my like a little ways outside of my house, which I go to regularly because there's a movie theater in it with my daughter who just turned 9. And there's a Sears, like the old department store Sears, that one, like a huge part of the mall is this old Sears. And it's enormous and vast, and it's completely abandoned. There's even a sign on the door of one of them that says, like, if you're interested in our services, you can find us online. And I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and it says, or go to the closest Sears, which is, I forget where, somewhere in Illinois or something like that. So it's really far away. And so sometimes when the movie theater on a Sunday, if we get out like after 7, I think the mall closes after 7. And so you can't walk through the mall to get to where the cars and the buses and stuff are. So you have to walk all the way around the Sears. And I always think, and my daughter and I call it the temple of the abandoned Sears. And I think I started to say, I think I told her about this poem. And whenever we go by it, I say, look on my works, you mighty in despair. So it's that Sears is what I think of, the old Sears building.
Wow. Yeah. That's a new one that I've not, yeah, that's definitely a new one because I was going to say, yeah, no, to me, this poem is beautiful and evocative, but also very political, right? Shelley was writing in a time where they were getting things from Egypt and bringing it to the UK, and also Ozymandias himself, or Ramesses II, was probably thinking, like, I am the greatest, I am the best, I will be here forever, love me, right? So yeah, like, to me, it's always kind of a memento mori, like a just big shining sign that nothing lasts forever, even though he thought it would. Like, to me, it speaks of monumentality and legacy and some of these bigger themes that aren't so in your face like a statue. But the comparison is excellent, so it works in so many different contexts, which is one of the reasons I love it so much. But to go with sort of the more meta ideas behind it, right? Keeping that in mind, the last question I ask every guest who comes on the podcast is, if you consider our modern society, and you can reuse the same answer if you would like, but do we have a modern equivalent of Ozymandias, right? Something we think is so great, and realistically, like, humans 500 years ahead of us, like, are they going to agree? Are they going to think we're crazy? And this could be, person, place, idea, concept, no matter how meta it is.
I'm going to stick with my answer, the mall. I'm going to stick with the mall as, like, what you were saying about the poem and its relation to politics, right? It's similarly true in its relationship to economics and the political dimensions of that, right? It's like the whole capitalist thing. It's supposed to grow and get bigger and persist and renew itself with constant sale and the turning over of merchandise, which of course is related to kind of things being moved all over the world. And now, there's the temple of the abandoned Sears in Easttown Mall in Madison, Wisconsin. But then other parts of the mall are thriving, just like in the ancient Rome, like people use the ruins, or like use the temple as a granary or a place for sheep or something like that 1,000 years later. So we haven't gotten to that point of repurposing yet, unfortunately. But I think I'll stick with the mall.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good one. And it's a nice personal one too, that you can, like, personally go and pass. So I appreciate those even more, because that's like a tangible example that we can point to. And yeah, I'm even trying to think, like, oh my gosh, when was the last time I saw a Sears? Let's see. I mean, there's a Columbia Mall in Columbia, Missouri, where I went to school, and I'm pretty sure that one of the big corner stores was a Sears, but I don't remember if that was, like, still operating or if it was just, like, gone. I don't remember. But yeah, it's been a long time since I've thought about a Sears.
Well, there's one in Illinois. I know there's one in Illinois.
Oh gosh, I'm from Chicago. This is embarrassing. I don't know where it is.
I forget where. It was someplace that I hadn't heard of in Illinois that they have on their sign, like to go there if you're interested in shopping on the floor.
Oh, okay, great. Then I feel no guilt whatsoever about not knowing like a small weird place in the state of Illinois. So, but great answer. I love your Sears answer, and I do actually really want to figure out where that Sears is, and then maybe I'll put it in the show notes. So if people in Illinois or Wisconsin want to find a Sears, they can go there. But I did kind of lie. There is one
Nothing
more
there.
question that I'm going to ask you, and that is, where can people find you if they want to like find your work?
I don't have any social media thing. I have an academia.edu page. I came out with a book recently, which is a translation of some Christian poets, of a couple of poets, and it has a long introduction which I wrote for it has some scholarship in it, but it's also meant to introduce these poets for general audience. So I would love it if people looked at that. If I put in a plug for my book, it's the selections from the poems of Paulinus of Nola is the name of the book, and it's came out with Routledge. And I don't know, I think that intro is more accessible, I'd like to think, than some of my other work. But I don't have any social media. You just have to write me an email.
That's fine. We can link your faculty page where they can access your email, and then we will also try to find a good link for your book where they can go and check it out if they wish to. And then we can also link your academia page so we can make you somewhat findable for people who are interested in the things that you are currently writing, have written, or will write in the future. So, and yeah, maybe someone will send you an email and say, hey, I want to take a class with you because this sounded really cool. So, yeah, I just want to thank you once again for joining me on the podcast today. It's been a real pleasure. I always love talking to people who are really into poetry because it was never my thing. But the more I learn as I talk to people, the more, like, the greater appreciation I have for poetry. And it makes me want to go back and read more ancient poetry. So, thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.